exciting topic. But there's a big focus on assessment and assessment literacy and balanced assessment in the district right now. And what I appreciate is the opportunity to kind of give you guys the big picture of why we're doing that and how it all fits together. So that's why I'm here this morning, to tell you kind of like a few things about the assessment system and why that's a focus right now. So I'm going to go ahead and get rolling here. So what we're going to try to do today is we're going to define what a balanced assessment system is and its purpose. Establish a common assessment vocabulary around assessment in the district. A little bit of a drive-through on assessment literacy, understanding what it is and what it should be used for. Little history lesson about the work that's been done here in Wayne Westland already. And then where we are now and where we plan to go with assessment. So first of all, why do we even need a balanced assessment system? What's the point of it? So sometimes when you have an opportunity to hear from people who can explain it better than you, you use them. And there's a gentleman by the name of Rick Stiggins. He used to be in charge of the ACT. And then he started to understand that wasn't enough, and that really didn't help kids learn. And he's going to talk about that. But he left ACT and started something called the Assessment Literacy Institute, which was bought by Pearson. And this whole balanced assessment kind of originated from him. He's one of the key players in it. I know the video looks like it's from 1978, but it's not. It's actually from 2014. So I'm going to let Rick kind of explain this.
And we're going to do that in some detail. So balanced assessment with quality assessments, helping students feel a sense of control over their own academic well-being. With regard to this matter of balance, we've been operating our assessment systems in the United States for at least 70 years on the assumption that if we just conduct the right standardized test at the right point in the year and deliver the results to the right people, schools will evolve in productive ways. There's compelling evidence that we've believed that annual standardized tests yield good schools. We've been doing it for 70 years, district-wide, statewide, national assessment, international assessment. I have on good authority that we've already shipped a scanner up to the space station, so we'll be ready for interplanetary assessment. Someone cite for me, please, the scholarly reference that I can go to learn that that's been a quality investment in terms of improving student learning. What is the effect size attributable to these annual tests? Attributable to effect size and standard deviation units of improved student learning due to this multi-decade, billions of dollar investment in this belief. Now, it's not that I'm opposed to annual standardized testing, but what we now understand, based on 20 years of good solid research, is that annual assessments balanced with interim benchmark assessments, balanced with high-quality classroom assessment, now we're talking turkey in terms of improving schools. The reason is that critically important data-based instructional decisions are made at all of these levels. And if assessment is the process of gathering information to inform instructional decisions, then I submit to you that in any context, unless we begin with answers to these three questions, what decisions, who's making them, and what information do they need, we don't have hope of making good decisions or using assessment productively in that context. Now, it turns out that the context of use of assessments is critical. And what I mean by this is that we use assessments to influence decisions at the classroom level. This is important, at the classroom level, at the interim benchmark level, and annually. Those contexts bring with them different users with different questions and different information needs. We build balanced assessment systems when we honor the information needs of all of those users. In addition, balanced assessment systems support student learning. We call this in our parlance assessment for learning, and the question here is, how can we use the assessment process and its results to help students learn more? That, as balanced with the use of assessment on the summative side, which is to certify or verify learning. We call those assessments of learning, where we ask how much of our students learned up to this point in time. Different purposes, different ways of using assessment, formative and summative. The mistaken belief has been that annual tests are sufficient. They're not. Balanced assessment is sufficient to inform key decisions. And the point I want to make is that the classroom level of assessment is the one level of those three that has been documented in research to enhance student learning. And so I argue that if we can put all three pieces in place with the classroom level of assessment as the foundation of a balanced system, then we're doing the right thing. Here, let me say that to you in a different way. And I'm going to read this to you as it appears. If classroom assessment isn't working productively day to day in the classroom during the learning, that is, if bad decisions are being made day to day during the learning based on inaccurate information coming from inept classroom assessments, do you understand that the other levels of assessment can't overcome the dire consequences for the learner? The damage has already been done, and you don't fix that every few weeks, once a semester, or once a year. Classroom assessment is the balance. And when we manage the classroom level of assessment productively, achievement score gains abound.
So, to expand on what Rick said, assessment, balance. I'm going to talk more about that and how we've taken what Rick's laid out here and are beginning to utilize it in our district. So, as Rick mentioned, they're decision makers who make decisions every single day with data. Who are they and what questions are they trying to answer? They're different depending on who it is. At the state level, this is what the decisions are made. What schools need more support / recognition? Okay? They're trying to, they've got a responsibility, they're doling out the money. They've got a responsibility to try and provide all students with the equal opportunity to get an education. Where are the gaps? Where do they need to put the resources? Are they always perfect with it? Nope. We've all experienced that. But that's the decisions they're trying to make. Are there certain segments of our student population that need more support? Those are state decisions. District policymakers and school administrators. Do we have the systems in place to support teachers and students to maximize learning? Do we have the resources? Do we need to change resources? They need information to make those decisions. Is the adopted instructional program delivering learning as promised? Teachers, you guys have decisions that you make all the time. What standards has each student mastered? Where are my students now in their learning? What comes next for my 25 to 40 or 150 at the secondary level students? What comes next for them in their learning? And therefore, what do I need to do in my instruction to support them? Families need information. Is my child progressing in a satisfactory manner? Where and how can I help my child? They need information to make those. And here's the group that often gets left out. Students. Students need information. Where am I now? What comes next for me? What's my hope of continuing to grow in this subject? What's the point? Am I going to try today? I would argue that students make the most important decision every day, because I know all of you have experienced, if that child decides they're not doing school today, you can do backflips, cartwheels, whatever you want to do. There ain't much you can do, right? We've got to, the new model is we've got to start to engage students in their own learning. And there's ways to do that. But that's kind of been the forgotten group a little bit. We just don't think about it. Not that the kids are forgotten, but we don't think about them and involving them in the process in the same way as we do some of these other folks. So, the information needs of all those stakeholders, they've all got decisions to make, but they require different types of data and assessments that are built to provide that data. So if you have a balanced assessment system, you're meeting the needs of all those groups, okay? So balanced assessment sounds like a good idea. We probably should be doing it, but dang, there's no time. I got to do this, I got to get grades in, I got to get ready for parent-teacher conferences, I got all this stuff I got to do. Why? We've only got so much time. Why should we put it here? Well, how many's familiar with MyKIP? Probably a little bit. MyKIP is the district. It's actually a big change. When I used to do NCA accreditation, I don't know if any of you have been around for that, but we used to put on a dog and pony show once every 3 or 4 years. we put together these files, right, and then they come in and review them. Oh, okay, you guys are fine. We check off all the boxes, and then they go in this file cabinet until 4 years later when we had to do it again. Well, my kid's new, and it actually is a process that's ongoing, and it's a new system that's much better. And it involves this continuous cycle of improvement where you plan, implement, monitor, evaluate, and assess needs. If you're going to do this work, these three, monitoring, evaluating, and assess needs, all require good assessment data, balanced and quality assessments. Professional learning communities, we've talked about those for a long time. There's 4 essential questions that you're supposed to ask if you're doing professional learning communities correctly. What do we want students to learn? How will we know if they learned it? What will we do if they didn't learn it? And what will we do if they already know it? Well, this first one, how will we know if they learned it? Obviously, to truly know, we need quality assessment. Second, what do we do if they didn't learn it? And what will we do if they already know it? Those are actually formative assessment practices, and you've heard that a bit recently about FAME and formative assessment. So why do we put the time in here? If we're going to get better, we've got to collect good evidence. And we've got to have good evidence for people to make decisions. So that's my argument as to why we need to put the time here. So at this point, I've been in my career for a while. I'm going like, we need a balanced assessment system. But to try it truthfully, any of you who know me for a while, I was a high school principal essentially for 22 years. Okay? I'm not an assessment expert. All right? I'm not a psychometrician. I'm not those things. How do you build a balanced assessment system? I wasn't quite sure. Came across, happened to be in the right place at the right time, District Assessment Design Toolkit. And I know the people on here. Former director of assessment for the state of Michigan, Joseph Martineau. Brilliant dude. I understand about 10% of what he says, but he knows what he's doing. These folks, Ed Raber preceded Joseph in that role. Kathy Dewsbury-White and Ellen Vornkamp, you guys may have run across her. She's from Wayne Reese. These folks know assessment. And I went, and they had this toolkit that they were rolling out that was new to help districts design an assessment system, a balanced assessment system. So we missed out on the initial one in 2018, but we were in the second. You'll notice it says beta. We were the 4th district in the state to do this work. The toolkit's intended to provide a structure for a team of our stakeholders to have the difficult conversations in a principled manner that are necessary to design a sound, useful district assessment system. It helps structure a process over a set of workshops, ultimately providing an assessment system. So it's designed to, that's a long way of saying it's there to help you design your system. It doesn't make it for you, doesn't implement it, it gives you the design. So we started this work, missed out in 2018, but spring of 2019, put together a team of 18 members from the district, representatives from central office, 6 from elementary schools, 3 from middle schools, 5 from the high schools, 5 administrators, 9 teachers, 3 special education educators, and 5 instructional coaches to do this work in the spring of 2019. We put this team together. Also, to ensure that we could all participate fully, we brought in Dr. Vornkamp, Dr. Ellen Vornkamp, to kind of facilitate that work. It's important to have that person because, you know, when your kids don't listen to you and then all of a sudden somebody else says something to them and they have this big epiphany and they get it. Same idea. We brought in somebody from the outside to help guide us. This is a list of folks that were involved, the list of participants. About half of them are still here, unfortunately. But they are still here. These are the folks that did the work to put this thing together. So I'm going to run you through the process real quick, what they did. So, as I said, some workshops. First, there were 3 workshops. First workshop around assessment literacy and appropriate use of assessments. So, first thing we needed to do was align our language. There are certain terms that we discussed that cause disagreements. Things like the word assessment. What does that actually mean? What's reliable assessments? What are valid assessments? what's a formative assessment, what's a summative assessment. I actually was in a room one time for about a half an hour discussion about whether something was formative or summative. The problem is if you aren't speaking the same language, you get hung up on the minutia and you don't really get where you need to go. So we've got to speak the same language. Even if we don't come in at the same, we got to walk out with the same language. So first of all, let's talk about assessment. We have to understand that tests and assessment are not the same thing. People often use them as synonyms. They're not. Tests are usually summative in nature, giving information at the end of the learning cycle. The term assessment is more comprehensive. It encompasses all kinds of evidence collection. So there's a bad habit, we talk about M-step assessment. That's really more of a test, but it is an assessment. So all tests are assessments, but not all assessments are tests. Assessments can be all of these things. And you do many of these things in your classroom every day. Observation, projects, performances. You do worksheets, you do questions. All of that is assessment. You're gathering evidence of student learning to help guide your decision making. Summative or formative depends on when you collect the evidence. And hopefully a lot of you have heard summative and formative somewhere along the line. But it depends on summative and formative is when you collect the evidence and what you and your students do with it. So formative versus summative. Summative assessment is assessment of learning, as Rick mentioned, certified learning. In other words, did the students learn it? That's your M step. We want to know, did they learn what we wanted them to learn? That's summative assessment. Formative assessment for learning, that's where we take the evidence to help students learn. M step doesn't help students learn. M step tells us whether they did learn. Okay? Formative assessment helps students learn. We've actually, as things have evolved in the assessment world, there's really another term that we throw in the middle, interim. So summative assessment is assessment of learning. Interim assessments are summative in nature, so like a weekly quiz or something, but where you can take the evidence and then go back and say, oh, they didn't get this standard, so I'm going to go back and reteach. So that really falls into the area of interim assessment. And then formative assessment becomes very much more about the process rather than an event. And we'll get more about that in a minute. So in this graphic, it can maybe help explain a little bit. So on the vertical axis, the higher up on the vertical axis it is, the bigger the content covered. So your M step would be up here, and the frequency on the horizontal is how often it happens. So M step would be right here at the peak. Okay, covers a long break. It covers the whole year. Okay, and it only happens once a year. Formative assessment, the most formative stuff happens every day in your classroom 10 times a day with each student. You're asking them questions, you're getting feedback, all that stuff. Okay, and then interim assessments live here in the middle. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay? All right, so second part of that was assessment literacy. Gentleman, author, I really like Jim Popham. I'm paraphrasing him here, but why should teachers become more assessment literate? Why should they know more about assessment? The more teachers understand about assessment design and purpose, the more likely it is that they will make good decisions with the data. Makes sense, right? Good decisions by teachers benefit their students. That also makes sense. Assessment literacy means more good decisions. More good decisions make you a better teacher. I couldn't argue with any of those statements, right? Making good decisions means avoiding the bad decisions that assessment illiterate teachers make. And not just teachers. He used the term teachers, but illiterate legislators. Illiterate, there's all kinds of assessment illiterate folks out there. What's the result of that? Using the wrong assessments for the wrong things to make decisions. We'll talk about that in a minute. Misusing the results of right assessments, and failing to employ instructionally useful assessments. So let's take a look at that first one, using the wrong assessments. Rick covered this. Most of today's standardized tests are accompanied by no evidence that those tests are suitable for an evaluative mission. They're not built for that. They weren't designed to do that. We're misusing them. What's the result of that? Well, Truly effective schools are forced to abandon methods that are working well for their students because the wrong tests are incapable of detecting the progress students are making. You guys all understand that M-STEP measures the grade level, right? So that whole test is within that narrow band of, if it's a 4th grade test, it's all 4th grade stuff. You could have a student walk into your room at a 2nd grade level if you're a 4th grade teacher. You could take them, and I'm using generalizations, but you could take them to a 3rd, 3.5, grade 3.5 level, right? Made a year and a half's worth of growth in a year. It's not going to show up on the M-STEP. Does that mean that there was bad teaching? Of course not. But that test is not designed to measure that. That test is designed to measure, do the kids know the 4th grade material? There's lots of factors why they might not, but that's what it's designed to do. And it does a good job of doing what it's supposed to do. We just use it for the wrong stuff. On the other side, sometimes weak schools are regarded as strong simply because they're students who come from families supporting a higher socioeconomic status learned in the home what they are not learning in school. Okay, we didn't have the TAG program anymore, but think about the TAG program. I'm sure those were all good teachers, but it didn't matter what they did all year. Their kids were all going to be proficient on the M-STEP when they walked in the room in the fall. So we also get with just using M-STEP, we get a false sense of, look, our kids are all doing great. Well, maybe they didn't learn a thing. We don't know. That test can't tell us that. Okay? Misusing the results of the right test. So that's the argument against the wrong test. Sometimes tests are good for one thing, but we use the results incorrectly. So there's one topic today. I'm going to make it quick. In the center, there's a sheet. This is your only task for today. I'm going to give you 2 minutes. It's a short read from Jim's book. So we're going to make it quick because I got to keep it rolling here. But go ahead and read that assessment literacy. It's a short read. Got 2 minutes. Start here. Throwing this back up. Normally I'd ask you and try to get any predictions or any experiences you have, but I'm just going to cheat and go right straight to that. Hopefully you recognize NWA in that. NWA is not a formative test. NWA is way up on the summative end. NWA does what we want it to do. It's a great predictor. Our correlation with M-STEP is over 0.9. That means that if kids do well on NWEA, they do well on M-STEP. If they do poorly on NWA, they do poorly on M-STEP. What advantage NWA gives us is it can tell us, I mentioned a student who was a 2nd grader. It gives us an idea of where they're at. Okay? And it can guide some stuff initially, but it doesn't happen frequently enough to really truly help students learn. It tells us where they're at, what they have. Okay? You ever heard the expression, if all I got to hammer, everything looks like a nail? One of our problems in the district is all we've had is NWA, so we tried to use it for everything. And it didn't work. But we were forced into it at times. For using the right test, it's good at what it does, but we got to use the right results properly. Okay? And finally, the last thing that assessment illiterate folks do is they fail to employ instructionally useful tests or assessments. Black and William in 1998 did an analysis on 20 large-scale studies of formative assessment practices back in 1998. And what they found is that it had an effect size of 0.4 to 0.7. Here's that thrilling statistics stuff. But 0.4 to 0.7, if you've heard of John Hattie and his 250 biggest influences on student learning, that would put it among the highest. So 0.4 to 0.7 translated means it has the potential to accelerate learning or to considerably accelerate student achievement. That was in 1998. Okay? Many of the studies showed that improved formative assessment practices help the so-called lowest attainers more than the rest. So they found that it had an impact, a measurable impact on student learning, and it had the biggest impact on low achievers, formative assessment practices. We'll talk more about that. And it's the evolution. Classrooms now, a little bit more like a GPS system. We used to be like a train. We were just hauling the kids with us when I was teaching way back a million years ago. We went up, we delivered the content, but kids today have to be more adaptive. So now we become more like a GPS system. We got to help the kids go from where am I now to where do I need to get to. We need to know where the student gaps are. If there aren't any gaps, then we don't need to teach them. We can move on. But if there are gaps, we need to instruct, gather more evidence to determine. Like this guy here, he clearly got the GPS going recalculating right now, right? He's headed the wrong direction. You got other kids who are on the right. We're navigating all those kids and we're collecting all that evidence. That's formative assessment in the moment. So let's go back. That's just kind of a descriptor of formative assessment. So let's look at the research on assessment. Summative assessment, no research shows any correlation to student learning. It tells us whether they learn, but it doesn't help students learn. That's research-based truth. Formative assessment. Black and Williams came back, actually, Dylan Williams in 2007, so almost 20 years later. By that time, there were over 4,000 research studies that just even more clearly defined and backed up that when implemented well, formative assessment can effectively double the speed of student learning when done well and intentionally. This is Jim Popham. He speaks it like it is, former professor at UCLA. Let's see. So I'm going to let him talk.
Formative assessment is one of those gems that's sitting in your jewelry case and you don't realize it's worth millions. It is an incredibly powerful, research-ratified way of using classroom testing to get students to learn better. It provides teachers and students with an opportunity to decide whether they need to adjust what they're doing. Kids need to maybe modify how they're trying to learn something. Teachers need to modify how they're going to teach something. But they don't do it on the basis of whim or caprice. They do it because of evidence collected along the way. And what offends me in our country is that we simply do not use this evidence the way we ought to. We don't use formative assessment. Formative assessment, if done well, there's research to support this, can literally double the speed of student learning, double it. And yet we don't use it all the time. It's incredible, offends me. We need to do something about this, and maybe people watching this will realize that they need to look hard at formative assessment. It's a winner.
Okay, so I like Jim. He kind of looks like Ellen Fudd. But he tells it he's like 80 years old and he doesn't pull any punches about it. He's very understandable. So that's his take and mine as well, that we've got to use it more. So going back to this process that we went through the assessment, literacy, appropriate use. It ran you through a little bit of that work. Next, what we did is we did an assessment inventory. So we took a look at all the assessments being done on a broad basis in the district and cataloged. I mean, it was an intensive process. We looked at what level was given, who had control over timing, was it the teacher, school, district, who controlled the content. So like MSTEP, state controls the content. Your classroom quiz, the teacher controls the content, for example. Coverage, we cataloged every bit of this information at that time. Again, spring 2019. Put that all together as evidence of where we were at. Okay, so we did the assessment inventory tool. The next thing that the group had to do was review the district and review this information and begin to design our system. Keeping two things in mind. Parsimony, which means duplication. So some of you have heard of iReady, right? It would be foolish for us to give iReady and NWA. They give us the same thing. It's done. You're wasting time. So did we have any of that going on? And then coherence. This is where we fell a little short. But coherence, do all of our assessments make sense together? Or are we just doing random things? That was the other part of the work that began in the second workshop. And here's one of the big things that we found. And this is just another descriptor of an assessment system, formative assessment here, summative assessment, and then those interim assessments that I described would fall in here, right? So when we did our evaluation of the evidence we had from the assessment audits, here's what we figured out. We didn't have any of those. We didn't have any. This and this are totally disconnected. We got nothing in the middle. What's the impact of this? If you're missing parts of your assessment system, here's your formula for success. We're working hard in the classroom. We got these M-STEP that do what they're supposed to do, but we got no work, just kind of expecting a miracle to happen in the middle because we can't connect the two dots. There's no way. Okay? We don't have that. So what's the real life impact of this? You guys recognize this from EduClimber, right? When I pull this, it took me like 2 seconds to find these examples, right? In most of these systems, you guys know green and blue is good, red is bad, right? There's examples of this all over the place. This is elementary literacy. Phonics and Pinnell, now this is a year old, so I know we moved the letters and past and stuff, but far behind, right? Bottom 20%. But here, we're reporting that our standards they're okay. Elementary math. Not proficient, bottom 20%, 4s, is what we're telling the families. And it's not unique to elementary, don't get me wrong. This is middle school. B's, B pluses. Not proficient, bottom 20%. High school. A's and B's. In algebra 2, bottom 20% in math. Sorry, this is SAT. Didn't have the performance bands in there, but that is not college and career ready. We've got a disconnect. And it's understandable because we can't connect the dots. Okay? So we had parents when third grade reading law changed, we're reporting to parents that they're doing okay, but they're getting a letter from the state saying they might be retained. That's going on. Because we don't have that connection. It's not somebody's fault. It's just we aren't connecting the dots. If a group of stakeholders does not have access to the appropriate data that they need to make good decisions, they have no hope of making valid data-driven decisions, no matter how good their intention is. If they don't have the right evidence and they're not prepared to do it, then they're not going to make good decisions. That's not their fault. It's the way it is. So we identified one big gap there in this work. Okay, so that was workshop 2. We've identified our gaps. Workshop 3 came back together, review, revise system design, and formalize team recommendations. So we needed a system where educators share power. So teachers needed to get what they needed, district needed to get what they needed, and so on. Okay, everybody gets their thing. So that's the power sharing. System is it cohesive? Does it align? Does it all work together? Implementation. How are we going to make it happen? Okay? And then finally, maintenance. It's not enough to just get it in place. You got to maintain it. You got to keep after it, or it's going to fall apart. We had common assessment, interim assessments at one time, 12 years ago, and then they fell out and went away. Okay? Quite frankly, it was part of the design. Okay, and a bunch of other factors, but we had them at one time. So if you don't maintain it, it's going to fade away like anything else. You got to always revisit the basics. So that was the work, and this was what the team came up with. So let me explain the schematic. Everything in blue is controlled by the state, both timing and content. Everything in green is controlled by the district, and everything in orange and red is controlled by the teacher as far as assessment. Okay, and it all works together and flows. And this is the desired state. Does everybody understand that? Okay. There's a problem with that, though. People don't understand it if I'm standing here to explain it. When they see it on its own, it doesn't make sense. So reimagine it a little bit. Think about it this way. Just like you start with your standards when you're looking to instruct your students. You start with the standards, curriculum and resources, all the way down to what you do every day in the classroom. This should all align, right? Because the point is to get what's going on every day in the classroom to make this happen. That's kind of the point of what we're doing, right? So the standards guide our work down to here. In the same way, in an assessment system, colors are the same as what I described a minute ago. So orange and red is the teacher control, green is district, and blue is is state, and the size of the bubbles is to indicate time spent. Okay, time and spent and energy. Where should we put our most time? So daily formative assessment is the biggest bubble on purpose. Okay, M-STEP happens once a year. Feels like a lot, but it's really not much. Right? For most kids, it's basically, for 3rd and 4th graders, it's like half a day total of testing. We spend like 12 days, 15 days getting ready for it, but they only spend half a day. So this is our balanced assessment system. This is our desired state. This is not where we are. Okay? This is where we want to get to. And one of the reasons, and what you've got to have in between is you've got to have feedback. So your daily formative assessment and your interim assessments have to influence this. You can't wait, like Rick said, if we wait till the summative assessment M-STEP every year and then try and make changes and send it all the way back to daily classroom, it's too far. Damage has already been done, as Rick said. We've got to have continuous feedback loops from these assessments to help from the major interims to help plan for our minor units to address the gaps that we see. Okay? And then the most important piece that we know influences based on the research, formative assessment within the lesson, moment to moment, and being intentional about it. Okay? So this is our true graphic of our desired state, our balanced assessment system that we're working for. Okay? So the team came out of this with 8 recommendations. 3 of them, there were 8. One of them I just kind of dismissed because it really was around teacher evaluation, not because they wanted to, because they felt they had to at the time. There were 7 others that were really more relevant. 3 of them were related to the need for district common assessments. 3 recommendations from the team. So those district common assessments, so how are we addressing those 3 recommendations? What we did, so I should back up just a little bit. So remember, we did all this work in spring of 2019, right? Fall of 19, we kind of started the work. We started doing some stuff with administrators. We had instructional coaches do a little bit of formative assessment training. And then spring of 2020, we all know what happened, right? It all went to whatever. So it all went away. So this obviously got put on hold. We tried to, coming back the fall, we tried to start to introduce, we were actually ahead of the game a little bit in elementary. We tried to do some stuff. That was a bad idea, as we learned out very quickly. But if you never try, you don't know. But fall of 2021, we tried to start introducing some of it, and it didn't go well. 21, we were teaching kids to be back in school. 21, 22, I'm sure all of you remember that. So finally, in the spring of 23, we started to be able to, or spring of 22 actually, we started to begin the work. So how are we going to address those recommendations? District content leads, grade level leads, and department heads, starting at the common assessment, getting those interim assessments that we were missing. That was that work, and we're tasking them with doing that work. In spring of 23, they had 2.5 days of training of building quality assessments. They went and learned about the summative test design process, focusing on steps 5 through 14. Determine effective ways. Trying to keep an eye on my time. Okay. So they went through a process learning how to begin to develop quality assessments. Happy to say that we have common assessments at the elementary level. Are they where they need to be? Nope. But if we never do them, they're not going to get better. And you got to revisit them each year and make improvements and see where the gaps are. And they're tasked with getting those, with doing those. They're opening it up to folks for input, but they've got to be done. And we all have decisions. I hope you all participate in that level of work with yours. But I understand life gets in the way. You got kids, you got this, you got that. Please understand that these are going to happen regardless, because we got to have them. Okay? But if you want to have input in it, we should have an opportunity to do that. But they're going to they need to happen, because we can't have that gap anymore. Okay? Those things are for folks at the district level. If they don't have that information, they can't tell whether resources are working. All we have is opinions if we don't have anything else. Okay, and opinions don't really help. So they did that work. They were trained spring of 2023 to start building quality assessments. We've got work to do. There'll be work this summer on them to improve them. Next steps. Summer 23-24, they worked on them. We got them in place, I said, at the elementary level. That's great that they're in place and we're using them. And then 24-25, full implementation. So we're actually a little bit ahead of the game at the elementary level. We got them there. We have to keep working on them. We have to improve them. But we're ahead of the game. Secondary's not all there yet. So we're ahead of the game in the elementary. The other 4 recommendations that came from the team were related to formative assessment. And quite frankly, we're working on getting these common assessments in place and filling that hole. But based on the research, going back to this slide, we know formative assessment helps kids learn. So we know that if we don't start doing that better, we're not going to see, even when we have those tests in place, we're not going to see the change unless we're doing this first. So this is the focus right now. We're putting more time and energy into formative assessment than the other. We've got to have it, but this is where the focus is. Limited time, limited resources. So the instructional coaches, and we're handling, so we talked about these assessments, getting this assessment system. Content's up here, the instructional coaches and are the focus, and they're leading the work around formative assessment. 6 components of formative assessment: clear learning goals and targets. I think I will say this, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. We have FAME teams in every single building in the district. High school, career tech, everywhere. Okay, every single tool. Having a huge impact, quite frankly. In fact, folks at the state are paying attention to the work that's happening here around formative assessment. We're starting to understand why learning targets are important and how they work. Better understand. We did them, but they're a compliance thing. Now we're understanding why we're doing it and how they connect. Using classroom questioning to elicit evidence of student thinking. Diagnosing learning needs to inform instructional next steps. Offering actionable feedback. Engaging students in self-assessment, peer feedback, and goal setting. Providing opportunities for students to track their learning and self-reflect. These are the 6 key components of critical components of formative assessment. Sometimes formative assessment is unfortunately named a little bit because bottom line, formative assessment is Tier 1 instruction in the way that it needs to be done for today. So we call it formative assessment, it's really Tier 1 instruction. Implementation of that, I mentioned FAME launch meetings back in the spring. They had, instructional coaches had 2.5 days of training around formative assessments, focused on formative assessment last spring. This fall we had FAME launch meetings. We have over 140 staff members across the district involved in formative assessment.
6 years.
6 years?
6 years.
Oh, 6 years, yeah. 140. That's roughly a little bit over 20% of our overall staff is in a formative assessment team. So, pretty proud of that. Somebody from the Michigan Assessment Consortium asked to come to our May 1st, is it May 1st PD, to observe what's going on around that. That's a statewide organization coming to see that. We are the first district to try a district launch and do it across the board. It's kind of been grassroots before. So a lot of folks are paying attention to how we're doing it. So far it's going well. We had October 4th and 5th, we had launches for the elementary and middle schools, October 16th at the high school. And what I don't have on here is that we had to add one because we had so many people we couldn't fit them all in, which is a high-class problem. 23-24, FAME teams in every building, we accomplished that. 24-25, full implementation, Tier 1 instruction. By that I mean we're going to start to introduce and expect to see some of these practices in every classroom. The FAME teams will be an exemplar. They're not going to go train people. They're going to be there to visit and to help, but they're not training, and this stuff's going to start to infiltrate and be expected in every classroom. Can't do anything if administrators aren't on board. Last piece of the puzzle. Falls apart, we all know what gets measured gets done. Central office and building administrators, working on a book actually by the crew that worked with Rick Stiggins on a lot of his stuff. 10 assessment literacy essentials for school leaders, focused on formative assessment. It's got 10. There's one specific chapter on formative assessment. That was their focus this year, was formative assessment. That's where we're putting our energy. This is Margaret Heritage. She's been a huge influence around the FAME program and formative assessment. And how much time do I have? Do we have time for Margaret to talk?
10 minutes.
10 minutes? I'll let Margaret talk. She's ready.
Well, that's a big one. I mean, I think the first thing I would say is that a district has to have commitment to assessment for learning and understand what it is. As you know, it's not more frequent mini summatives. So the clear vision for assessment for learning and then how it fits into the bigger assessment system. So I think some clarity around an assessment system that incorporates both assessment for learning and assessment of learning, but has balance. So one doesn't, the assessment of learning doesn't overwhelm the assessment for learning. So I think that's the first thing, to have this vision. The second thing is a commitment. As I said, formative assessment for learning, it doesn't happen overnight. So there's got to be a commitment to supporting teacher development for the long term. Both veteran teachers, newcomers to the profession, they all need that continued support. So that would be another thing I would say. And then I think they have to have structures in place so that that learning can take place. The leadership is essential. I mean, if leaders don't want to be involved, then what we have found is implementation is much less successful than if leaders have the vision, provide the support, and the follow-through and the encouragement. And I think they've got to prioritize. You know, as Michael Fullan said, the enemy of improvement is too many priorities. And I think districts that have been successful with formative assessment have been able to integrate formative assessment into existing initiatives. So teachers don't see it as, oh, yet one more thing that I've got to do in my classroom, but see it as worthwhile. So I would say the vision for the assessment system, the balance within the assessment system, the long-term commitment to instantiating assessment for learning as ongoing practice, and the leadership support for engaging teachers in ongoing professional learning.
About this, but I think it's important that everybody understand this is not just like pieces here and there, that this is all part of a grand path that we're trying to, and it's got a cohesive pathway that we're trying to achieve. There's research to back it up. There is a district commitment. We've got administrators on board with it and coming along too. All the pieces that Margaret described are in place. Will we maintain it? That's the plan. I've heard nothing different. But if we do that, there's research to support that. We know we have at-risk students. Coming from my background, a lot of my time was in alternative ed. Okay? Students who were not successful in school. I knew when kids walked into my building that if they didn't establish a relationship with an adult, we had no hope with those kids because they were already gone. Now those are high school kids that they've had years. They were on losing streaks in school. Formative assessment helps all build those relationships because you can't hear feedback if you don't have a relationship with the person who's giving it to you. You don't want to hear. Okay, so formative assessment incorporates all of that stuff, and that's why I think it's important. So thanks for the opportunity to give you the big picture and hope you understand why we're doing what we're doing, and it has a reason. So thank you for letting me come in and do that.
Thanks.